The morning of December 17, 1943, over Simpson Harbour, Rabaul. Major Gregory Boyington pushed his throttle forward, feeling the Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine of his F4U Corsair respond with its characteristic deep rumble that Japanese soldiers had nicknamed Whistling Death. Below him, through scattered clouds at 15,000 feet, he could see the most heavily defended Japanese base in the South Pacific. 5 airfields, 367 anti-aircraft guns, and somewhere down there, scores of Zero fighters waiting to intercept the first American single-engine aircraft to dare penetrate this far into enemy territory. Boyington keyed his radio. "Come on up and fight!" The response crackled back immediately, transmitted by Edward Chikaki Honda, a Hawaii-raised interpreter who had ended up wearing a Japanese uniform. "Come on down, sucker." What happened in the next hour would prove something profound about modern air combat. The Americans weren't going down, and that decision, that tactical discipline to fight their war rather than the enemy's preferred battle, represented a transformation that had been 18 months in the making. The question that would define the air war over Rabaul had already been answered, though the Japanese didn't yet understand it. Could systematic tactics and energy management defeat superior maneuverability? The Corsair pilots were about to demonstrate that altitude, speed, and tactical discipline made the Zero's legendary agility irrelevant. To understand why the Corsair's tactics seemed revolutionary in late 1943, you must first understand what marine aviation had become by that point, and what it had suffered getting there. The F4U Corsair arrived at Henderson Field on Guadalcanal on February 12, 1943. 12 aircraft from Marine Fighter Squadron 124, commanded by Major William Gies, represented the first operational deployment of the bent-wing bird that would eventually become the most capable carrier-based fighter of the Pacific War. But that reputation was far in the future. On Valentine's Day, 1943, just 2 days after arriving, the Corsairs flew their first combat mission, escorting B-24 Liberators on a raid against the Japanese aerodrome at Kahili. The results were catastrophic. Japanese fighters intercepted the formation with devastating precision. 4 P-38s fell in flames, 2 P-40s went down, 2 Corsairs were lost, 2 Liberators didn't return. American losses totaled 10 aircraft. Japanese losses? 4 Zeros. Maybe. The Marines grimly called it the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. One of the Corsair losses that day wasn't even from combat. First Lieutenant Gordon Lyon collided with a Zero piloted by Flight Petty Officer 2nd Class Yoshio Yoshida. Both aircraft disintegrated. Both pilots died. The Corsair's first confirmed aerial victory came from a mid-air collision, not superior combat performance. The problem wasn't the aircraft. The Vought F4U-1 possessed performance that should have dominated any Japanese fighter. The Pratt & Whitney double Wasp engine produced 2,000 horsepower on takeoff, pushing the Corsair past 400 miles per hour in level flight. It was the first American fighter to exceed that threshold. The aircraft could dive faster than anything the Japanese flew. It could climb to 20,000 feet in under 7 minutes. At high altitude, it was faster than the Zero by at least 50 miles per hour. But speed and power meant nothing if pilots tried to fight the Zero's fight. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Japanese fighter doctrine in 1943 was built around a single principle: the turning dogfight. The Mitsubishi A6M0 weighed barely 4,000 pounds empty. The Corsair weighed 7,600 pounds empty. This weight difference translated directly into turning radius. In a sustained turn at combat speeds, the Zero could complete a full circle in roughly half the diameter required by a Corsair. Zero pilots had trained for years before the war. Student pilots accumulated 500 to 700 flight hours in training, far more than their American counterparts, who typically received 200 to 300 hours. The emphasis was on stick and rudder skills, on feeling the aircraft respond to the slightest input, on instinctive knowledge of the flight envelope. By 1943, the best of these pilots had accumulated combat experience that dwarfed anything American aviators could match. They had flown over China, attacked Pearl Harbor, swept British and Dutch forces from Southeast Asia. They knew their aircraft intimately, they knew how to use its strengths, and they knew American pilots kept making the same fatal mistake, trying to turn with them. The tactical manual issued to Zero pilots was explicit. Engage enemy fighters in close combat. Use superior maneuverability to achieve a firing position on the enemy's tail, close to minimum range before firing. The manual specified firing ranges of 50 to 150 yards, distances where even a brief burst from the Zero's two 20mm cannon and two 7.7mm machine guns could inflict catastrophic damage. This wasn't theory. This was doctrine validated by 2 years of combat success. The problem facing Marine Corsair pilots in early 1943 was simple and deadly. Their training had emphasized individual aggressiveness and pursuit of enemy aircraft until destroyed. Standard American fighter doctrine called for pilots to engage, maneuver for position, and press the attack until the enemy fell or escaped. Against the Zero, this doctrine killed American pilots. A Corsair pilot, who tried to turn with a Zero, found himself immediately at a disadvantage. The Japanese fighter could turn inside the American's turning radius. Within 2 or 3 turns, the Zero would be on the Corsair's tail, guns firing. The Corsair's speed advantage became meaningless once committed to a turning fight. Escape required a dive, and diving meant breaking off the engagement, abandoning the fight. American pilots interpreted this as cowardice. Fighter pilot culture celebrated aggression, pressing the attack, never backing down. The idea of diving away from an enemy seemed fundamentally wrong, but the mathematics were unforgiving. Corsairs that tried to dogfight Zeros died. The evidence accumulated through the spring of 1943. Gun camera footage showed American pilots maneuvering desperately, trying to get their gun sights on twisting, turning Zeros that stayed frustratingly out of position. The Japanese pilots knew exactly what they were doing. They fought their fight, and they won. The transformation began not with a single tactical innovation, but with a gradual understanding among the most experienced Marine pilots that they needed to fight differently. Lieutenant Kenneth Walsh, flying with VMF 124, began experimenting with altitude tactics in April 1943. Walsh had arrived in the Pacific with minimal combat experience, but he learned quickly by watching which pilots survived and which didn't. The pattern was clear. Pilots who maintained altitude advantage and made single high-speed passes survived. Pilots who descended into turning fights with Zeros often didn't return. On May 16, 1943, Walsh intercepted a formation of Zeros at 19,000 feet. He was alone, separated from his division. Standard doctrine would have called for him to radio for help and maintain contact with the enemy without engaging. Walsh made a different choice. He climbed. He pushed his Corsair up to 23,000 feet, directly above the Japanese formation. Then he rolled into a dive, accelerating past 350 miles per hour. His gun sight tracked across the sky, leading a Zero by what seemed like an impossible margin. At 400 yards, he pressed the trigger. The Corsair's 650 caliber machine guns, 3 mounted in each wing, fired approximately 500 rounds per second total. The bullet stream converged at a point roughly 400 yards ahead of the aircraft. Within that convergence zone, the density of fire was devastating. The Zero Walsh targeted didn't gradually lose pieces or trail smoke, it simply disintegrated. One moment it was a functioning aircraft, the next it was tumbling wreckage falling toward the ocean below. Walsh didn't pursue. He extended his dive, building speed to over 400 miles per hour, then pulled up in a climbing turn that brought him back to 20,000 feet. The entire engagement lasted perhaps 10 seconds. 1 pass, 1 kill, immediate separation. The Japanese pilots turned to pursue, but the Corsair was already out of range, climbing away at a speed the Zeros couldn't match. Walsh returned to Henderson Field and filed a combat report that described something new. He called it diving and zooming. Later, other pilots would refine the terminology. Boom and zoom. Dive on the enemy from superior altitude. Fire at optimal range. Extend away using superior speed. Never turn, never slow down, Never give the enemy the fight he wants. But understanding the tactic and implementing it systematically across entire squadrons were different challenges. The cultural resistance was significant. American fighter pilots viewed themselves as aggressive hunters. The idea of making a single pass and climbing away seemed defensive, almost cowardly. Squadron commanders initially resisted formalizing tactics that seemed to contradict the offensive spirit they were trying to cultivate in their pilots. Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Lynch, who would later command the 395th Fighter Squadron in the Southwest Pacific, summarized the objection in a letter preserved in 5th Air Force records. "We're asking pilots to shoot and run. That's not how fighter pilots fight. It's not how Americans fight." The response to this objection came not from doctrine writers, but from arithmetic. Marines kept detailed records of combat results. By June 1943, the statistics were undeniable. Corsair pilots who engaged Zeros in turning fights achieved roughly 1-to-1 kill ratios. For every Zero destroyed, 1 Corsair was lost. These were the pilots who fought the way doctrine said they should fight. Aggressively, pursuing until the enemy fell. Corsair pilots who maintained altitude discipline and made single high-speed passes achieved kill ratios of 3-to-1 or better. 3 Japanese aircraft destroyed for every Corsair lost. The difference wasn't pilot skill, it was tactical discipline. By August 1943, Marine aviation leadership began formalizing the lessons learned over 6 months of bloody experience. The key figure in this transformation was Major Gregory Boyington, a former flying tiger with 6 victories in China, who had been given command of a newly reconstituted squadron, Marine Fighter Squadron 214. Boyington's instructions were unusual. He was told to assemble a squadron from available personnel who had been left out of regular assignments due to illness, the breakup of their original squadrons, or administrative errors. Some were veteran combat pilots with several kills to their credit. Others were newly arrived replacements. All were eager to fight, but none had been flying together as a unit. Boyington took 26 pilots to Turtle Bay on Espiritu Santo for intensive training. The emphasis wasn't on individual aerobatic skill or gunnery practice, it was on tactical discipline. The doctrine Boyington drilled into his pilots was revolutionary in its simplicity. Altitude is paramount. Whoever has altitude dictates the terms of the battle. The Corsair outperforms the Zero in every aspect except slow-speed maneuverability and slow-speed rate of climb. Therefore, never get slow when fighting a Zero. Make one pass. Fire at convergence range, between 350 and 450 yards. Then extend away immediately. Climb back to altitude. Repeat. Never turn with a Zero. Never. Not even once. The moment you start turning, you've given the Japanese pilot the fight he wants. And in a turning fight at low speed, the Zero pilot will kill you. If a Zero gets on your tail, dive. Use the Corsair's superior diving speed to separate. Climb away. Return to altitude advantage. Then re-engage on your terms. Fight in pairs. Always. Section leaders and wingmen maintain mutual support. If your leader dives, you dive with him. If he's attacked, you engage the attacker. No individual heroics, no lone wolf, attacks. This wasn't the romantic vision of air combat that American pilots had been raised on. It was systematic, mechanical, almost clinical, but it worked. VMF 214 flew its first combat mission on September 14, 1943. The Black Sheep, as they would soon call themselves, flew out of bases in the Russell Islands, staging through Henderson Field. Their assigned mission was routine: escort SBD Dauntless dive bombers attacking Japanese positions near Balale. The engagement that followed demonstrated the new tactics in action. Japanese Zeros rose to intercept at 18,000 feet. Boyington's Corsairs were at 23,000 feet. The Black Sheep didn't descend to meet the enemy. They waited until the Zeros reached maximum altitude, struggling for every foot of climb. Then Boyington led his division into diving attacks that accelerated them past 400 miles per hour. The speed differential made pursuit impossible. Zeros that attempted to follow simply couldn't keep up. The Corsairs flashed through the Japanese formation, guns firing in brief, precise bursts. 3 Zeros fell. The Corsairs climbed away. The entire engagement lasted less than 3 minutes. No Corsairs were damaged. No American aircraft were lost. The Japanese pilots, experienced men who had dominated Pacific air combat for 2 years, found themselves fighting an enemy they couldn't engage. The Americans refused to turn. They refused to slow down. They attacked from above with tremendous speed, fired at ranges where return fire was ineffective, then disappeared before the Zeros could respond. Over the next 3 months, the Black Sheep refined these tactics through constant combat. They flew missions almost daily, engaging Japanese aircraft over New Georgia, Vella La Vella, and Bougainville. The results were consistent. The Corsairs achieved multiple kills for each aircraft lost. By November 1943, the tactical transformation was complete. What had been experimental doctrine tested by individual pilots had become standard operating procedure across marine aviation. The target that would prove the effectiveness of these new tactics was Rabaul. Rabaul, on the northeastern tip of New Britain, was the most important Japanese base in the South Pacific. Simpson Harbor provided anchorage for cruisers and destroyers. 5 airfields housed approximately 300 aircraft. The base defended by 367 anti-aircraft guns, ranging from 13mm machine guns to 127mm cannon. An effective early warning radar system provided 90-mile coverage, giving defenders 30 to 60 minutes warning of incoming attacks. For 18 months, Rabaul had been effectively untouchable. Allied heavy bombers could reach it, but faced devastating losses from Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft fire. The Japanese considered Rabaul impregnable, the Pearl Harbor of the Southwest Pacific, the fortress that would anchor their defense of the Solomon Islands. But by November 1943, the situation had changed. Allied forces had captured Bougainville, putting Rabaul within range of single-engine fighters for the first time. Marine Corsair squadrons, now flying from Torokina Airfield on Bougainville, could reach Rabaul in less than 2 hours. The question was whether land-based fighters could challenge a heavily defended base that had shrugged off previous attacks. The answer came on November 5, 1943, when Admiral William Halsey ordered a carrier strike against Rabaul. Task Force 38, built around the carriers Saratoga and Princeton, launched their attack from near the Green Islands, 225 miles southeast of Rabaul. Flying through terrible weather, Navy aircraft attacked light cruisers and destroyers in Simpson Harbor. The results were mixed. Some damage was inflicted, but Japanese ships managed to evade most attacks in rain squalls. The real test came 2 days later. On November 11, 1943, a larger carrier force approached Rabaul. Task Group 50.3, commanded by Rear Admiral Alfred Montgomery, consisted of the fleet carriers Essex and Bunker Hill and the light carrier Independence. These were brand new ships, among the first of the massive Essex-class carriers that would dominate the Pacific War. Admiral Halsey ordered a combined strike using both the carrier aircraft and land-based fighters. For the first time, Corsairs from the land-based squadron VF-17 would join carrier aircraft in attacking the most heavily defended Japanese base in the Pacific. VF-17, commanded by Lieutenant Commander John Blackburn, had been operating from Ondonga on New Georgia. The squadron had originally been assigned to Bunker Hill, but was removed from carrier duty due to concerns about supplying spare parts at sea. The Corsairs, with their distinctive gull wings and long noses, were still considered problematic for carrier operations. But on November 8, 1943, VF-17 was ordered to provide top cover for the carrier task force during the Rabaul raid. 23 F4U 1. A Corsairs flew north from New Georgia, landing aboard Bunker Hill and Essex to refuel. It was an unprecedented operation, landing shore-based fighters on carriers they weren't officially assigned to, purely to extend their range for a single mission. The reunion was emotional for VF-17 pilots. They were landing on their former home, the carrier they had trained on, the ship they thought they'd fight from. Some of the deck crew recognized individual pilots. Maintenance personnel refueled and rearmed the Corsairs with the efficiency born of familiarity. Then the combined strike launched. Carrier aircraft and land-based fighters, over 100 aircraft total, turned toward Rabaul. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The Japanese detected the incoming raid at 1:13 p.m., with the American aircraft 119 miles out and closing. Vice Admiral Junichi Kusaka, commanding the 11th Air Fleet at Rabaul, faced a critical decision. Just 4 days earlier, Admiral Minechi Koga, commander of the combined fleet, had authorized Operation RO, sending carrier aircraft from the 1st Carrier Division to Rabaul from Truk. This reinforcement had arrived on November 1st. 173 carrier aircraft from the carriers Zuikaku, Shokaku, and Zuiho, 82 Zeros, 45 Type 99 carrier bombers, and 40 Type 97 carrier attack planes. These weren't ordinary pilots. They were the elite carrier aviators of the combined fleet, men who had trained for years, accumulated hundreds of combat hours, survived battles from Pearl Harbor to the Coral Sea. They represented the finest aerial combat capability Japan possessed. Kusaka launched them all: 27 Aichi-D, 3 A-2 dive bombers and 14 B-5N-2 torpedo bombers, escorted by 67 Zeros, followed by a flight of Mitsubishi G-4M-2 medium bombers. It was one of the largest anti-carrier strikes since the war in the Pacific began. American radar tracked them climbing toward the task force. Fighter directors aboard the carriers began vectoring interceptors into position. Then, at 1:51 p.m., a Corsair pilot from VF-17 reported enemy aircraft 40 miles away. The fighter director asked how many. The response became legendary. "Jesus Christ, boys! There's a million of them! Let's go to work!" The engagement over Rabaul on November 11th, 1943, began at 14,000 feet, with visual contact between opposing formations that together comprised over 200 aircraft. What followed would demonstrate the tactical transformation of American naval aviation in a battle that lasted less than 90 minutes, but fundamentally altered Japanese defensive calculations for the remainder of the war. The Corsairs of VF-17 held altitude advantage. They had launched from the carriers at 22,000 feet and maintained that altitude during the approach to Rabaul. Below them, the Navy's F-6F Hellcats from Essex, Bunker Hill, and Independence were positioned at 18,000 feet. The TBF Avengers and SBD Dauntless dive bombers were making their attack runs at lower altitudes. The Japanese formation climbed to intercept. The Zeros, unencumbered by bombs or torpedoes, could reach 20,000 feet, but only by sacrificing speed. The dive bombers and torpedo planes struggled to maintain formation at 15,000 feet. Lieutenant Commander Blackburn recognized the tactical situation immediately. His after-action report, preserved in Navy archives, described the moment with clinical precision. Enemy fighters climbing through 18,000 feet. Our position, 22,000 feet directly above intercept point, executed standard boom and zoom attack, rolled into dive at 2200 hours. Achieved 420 indicated airspeed, selected targets at 1,000 yards, commenced firing at 450 yards, observed multiple strikes, extended to 12,000 feet, climbed back to altitude. The language was bureaucratic, but it described something revolutionary. VF-17's Corsairs made diving attacks that accelerated them to speeds the Japanese couldn't match. They fired at ranges beyond effective return fire. Then they used their superior speed to climb away before the Zeros could respond. The mathematics of energy management dictated every move. A Corsair, diving from 22,000 feet to 12,000 feet, 10,000 feet of altitude, converted that potential energy into kinetic energy. The aircraft accelerated to over 420 miles per hour. At that speed, the Corsair could outrun any Zero in level flight, and had enough energy to zoom climb back to 20,000 feet. The Zero pilots attempted to counter using their traditional tactics. They tried to turn into the diving Corsairs, using their superior maneuverability to achieve firing position, but the Americans weren't there to be turned on. By the time a Zero completed its turn, the attacking Corsair was already 3 miles away, climbing back to altitude. Ensign David Walsh, flying as section leader in VF-17's 2nd Division, recorded his engagement in the post-mission debriefing. His account, typed on Navy stationery and preserved in National Archives records, provides insight into how the new tactics felt from the pilot's perspective. I picked a zero climbing at approximately 19,000 feet, rolled in from 22,000, built speed to 400, 10 indicated. The zero began a turn to the left, standard defensive maneuver. I continued my dive, angle to track his motion. At 500 yards, I adjusted for lead. At 420 yards, centered the Pipper and fired a 3-second burst, observed strikes across the wing root and engine cowling. Aircraft began trailing smoke, continued dive to 13,000 feet, throttled back slightly and began climbing turn to port. Regained 21,000 feet. Total time from initiation of attack to return to altitude, 45 seconds. 45 seconds. 1 diving attack. 1 0 damaged, possibly destroyed. Immediate return to altitude advantage. This pattern repeated across the engagement. Corsair pilots dove, fired, and climbed away. Japanese pilots attempted to engage, found themselves unable to close the speed differential, and watched their opponents disappear back into the altitude advantage. The Navy's Hellcat pilots, flying at 18,000 feet, executed similar tactics. The F6F was heavier and less maneuverable than the Corsair, but it shared the same tactical doctrine: altitude, speed, energy management. Never turn with the zero. Lieutenant Roger Hedrick, flying a Hellcat from Essex, led a division that intercepted a group of 18 Japanese dive bombers attempting to attack the carriers. The D3A2 Val dive bombers, loaded with bombs and committed to their attack runs, were vulnerable to high-speed attacks from above. Hedrick's division made 3 diving passes in rapid succession. Each pass lasted less than 30 seconds. Each pass destroyed or damaged multiple bombers. The Japanese formation, already under attack from anti-aircraft fire from the carrier screen, disintegrated under the assault from above. 7 D3As fell in flames. Several more were so badly damaged they couldn't maintain formation. Only a handful managed to complete their attack runs, and none of their bombs struck American ships. The torpedo bombers fared even worse. The B-5N2 Kate, flying straight and level to line up torpedo release, presented a perfect target for diving fighters. American pilots later described shooting them as target practice. Of the 14 B-5N2S that launched from Rabaul, all 14 were destroyed. Not one torpedo hit an American ship. But the engagement wasn't one-sided. Japanese Zero pilots, despite the tactical disadvantage, fought with skill and determination that claimed American aircraft and lives. The Corsairs and Hellcats, focused on their diving attacks, occasionally found themselves in situations where their tactical discipline broke down. Individual pilots, seeing an opportunity for a kill, sometimes extended their attacks into turning engagements. When that happened, the Zero's superior low-speed maneuverability reasserted itself. Lieutenant Commander Blackburn lost 2 Corsairs during the engagement. Both pilots had broken from their divisions to pursue individual targets. Both had gotten slow, committed to turning fights with Zero pilots who immediately exploited the American aircraft's weakness. One pilot, Ensign Thomas Barrett, managed to radio before his aircraft was hit. Got slow, Zero on my tail, can't shake him. His Corsair took cannon fire in the engine. Barrett ditched near Empress Augusta Bay and was rescued 6 hours later by a Navy destroyer. He was back flying within a week, chastened but alive. The other pilot wasn't as fortunate. Lieutenant Junior Grade Michael Crenshaw's Corsair was hit during a turning fight at 8,000 feet. Witnesses saw the aircraft catch fire and spin into the ocean. Crenshaw didn't get out. His body was never recovered. These losses illustrated the fundamental lesson that Marine and Navy pilots were still learning. The tactical doctrine worked, but only when pilots maintained discipline. One mistake, one moment of reverting to old habits, one decision to pursue a target into a turning fight could be fatal. The carrier aircraft and VF-17's Corsairs withdrew from the engagement zone at approximately 2:30 p.m. The entire battle had lasted slightly over 1 hour. American aircraft formed up and returned to their carriers. The Corsairs from VF-17 landed aboard Bunker Hill and Essex, refueled, and flew back to New Georgia the same day. The after-action reports, compiled over the following days, provided quantifiable evidence of the tactical transformation. American pilots claimed over 50 enemy aircraft destroyed. Post-war analysis, using both American and captured Japanese records, suggests the actual number was closer to 25. This discrepancy was typical of air combat, where multiple pilots often shot at the same target and each claimed it destroyed, where damaged aircraft that later crashed were reported as destroyed by pilots who never saw the final result. But even the conservative estimate of 25 Japanese aircraft destroyed represented a devastating blow. Vice Admiral Kusaka's after-action report, captured after the war, acknowledged losses of 6 Zeros defending. Rabaul and an additional 23 aircraft, all 14B-5N2S, 17D-3A2S, and 2 more Zeros, lost in the counterattack against the American carriers. The American losses totaled 8 aircraft, 2 Corsairs from VF-17, 6 Hellcats, and TBFs from the carrier air groups. Not a single American ship was damaged. The exchange ratio was approximately 3-1 in America's favor, 3 Japanese aircraft destroyed for every American aircraft lost. This wasn't the 11-1 ratio that would be claimed in post-war statistics, but it was decisive enough to force Japanese strategic recalculation. More significantly, the loss of the carrier-trained pilots hurt Japan far more than the loss of aircraft. The men killed over Rabaul on November 11th included Lieutenant Shigeru Araki, division officer from Zuikaku, and Lieutenant Masao Sato, air group commander from Zuiho. These weren't replaceable assets. Japan's pilot training program, already strained by 18 months of attrition, couldn't produce aviators of equivalent experience. The Americans, by contrast, had pilot training pipelines that graduated thousands of new aviators every month. Pilots lost in combat were replaced within weeks. Aircraft lost in combat were replaced from production lines, turning out hundreds of fighters per month. The Battle of November 11th proved that carrier-based aircraft could successfully attack a heavily defended land base and survive. Previous doctrine held that land-based air power, with its greater numbers and shorter response times, would always defeat carrier aviation. Rabaul demonstrated that doctrine was obsolete, but the real transformation was happening with the land-based Marine squadrons now flying from Bougainville. On December 17, 1943, 31 Marine F4U Corsairs, 23 Arenza AFP-40 fighters, and 22 Navy F-6F Hellcats launched the first major fighter sweep over Rabaul from land bases. This was the mission where Major Boyington taunted the Japanese to come up and fight. The engagement that followed demonstrated how far Marine tactical doctrine had evolved. The Corsairs, led by VMF-214, VMF-215, and VMF-216, held formation at 28,000 feet. This altitude was chosen deliberately. It was higher than the Zeros could efficiently climb while maintaining combat capability. Japanese fighters that reached that altitude were struggling, low on oxygen, engines gasping in the thin air. The Marines waited. They circled over Simpson Harbor, maintaining altitude, conserving fuel. Japanese radar had detected them. Kusaka knew they were there. But the Americans refused to descend. After 20 minutes, Japanese fighters began climbing to intercept. Approximately 40 Zeros struggled up to 25,000 feet. The Marines waited until the Japanese reached maximum altitude, then rolled into diving attacks. The pattern that followed was now familiar to both sides. Corsairs diving at tremendous speed, brief bursts of gunfire at optimal range, immediate extension, and climb back to altitude. Japanese pilots turning desperately, trying to achieve firing position, finding their opponents already gone. The engagement lasted 37 minutes. 7 Japanese fighters were confirmed destroyed by gun camera footage and multiple witness accounts. 3 Corsairs were damaged by return fire, but all returned to base. The exchange ratio was better than 2-1, despite the fact that the Americans were operating over the most heavily defended Japanese base in the Pacific. Major Boyington himself claimed 2 victories during this engagement. His combat film showed both attacks following textbook boom and zoom tactics. Dive from altitude. Fire at 400 yards. Extend immediately. Return to altitude. No turning. No pursuit. Clinical execution of tactical doctrine. Over the next 6 weeks, Marine squadrons flew repeated fighter sweeps over Rabaul. The Japanese responded by scrambling fighters to intercept, and the battles that followed produced some of the most intense air combat of the Pacific War. The statistics compiled by Marine aviation staff officers told the story of systematic tactical superiority. Between December 17, 1943, and February 20, 1944, Marine Corsair squadrons flew approximately 300 sorties over Rabaul. They claimed 94 aerial victories against 23 Corsairs lost. The 4-to-1 kill ratio represented the culmination of tactical evolution that began with the St. Valentine's Day massacre 11 months earlier. The Americans had learned to fight their war, not the enemy's. The Japanese learned a harder lesson. On February 20, 1944, the Imperial Japanese Navy commenced evacuation of all air units from Rabaul. The base that had been considered impregnable, the fortress that anchored Japanese defenses in the Southwest Pacific, was being abandoned. Not because it had been captured, not because supply lines had been cut, but because Japanese aviation could no longer operate effectively from it. American fighters now ranged freely over Rabaul. Japanese aircraft that took off were engaged within minutes by Corsairs and Hellcats that held every tactical advantage. The psychological impact on surviving Japanese pilots was profound. Lieutenant Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's highest-scoring aces who would survive the war with 64 victories, later wrote about the transformation he witnessed. By late 1943, the Americans had learned not to fight our type of battle. They refused to dogfight. They used altitude and speed. Their tactics were mechanical, without the artistry of aerial combat, but they were devastatingly effective. We could not force them to fight in the manner where our aircraft and training gave us advantage. They imposed their will on every engagement. Another Japanese pilot, whose account was captured in post-war interviews, described the frustration more bluntly. We couldn't fight them. They attacked from above with tremendous speed. We never had time to maneuver into firing position. When they fired, the concentration of bullets was unbelievable. Aircraft simply came apart. Then they were gone before we could respond. It was like fighting ghosts. The Americans weren't ghosts. They were pilots executing systematic tactical doctrine based on understanding their aircraft's capabilities and ruthlessly exploiting enemy weaknesses. The transformation wasn't dramatic. There was no single wonder weapon, no technological breakthrough that changed everything overnight. Instead, it was the accumulation of small improvements. Altitude, discipline, energy management, firing at convergence range, never turning with zeros, fighting in pairs with mutual support, immediate extension after attacks. These incremental changes, applied systematically across hundreds of pilots and thousands of sorties, produced revolutionary results. The men who developed and implemented these tactics paid prices that extended beyond the war itself. Major Gregory Boyington never broke Eddie Rickenbacker's record of 26 victories. On January 3, 1944, leading another fighter sweep to Rabaul, Boyington shot down his 26th enemy aircraft. The Zero burst into flames over Simpson Harbor. Multiple pilots witnessed the kill, but Boyington and his wingman, Captain George Ashmun, became separated from the formation in bad weather and low-level haze. They found themselves facing approximately 20 Japanese fighters. In the confused battle that followed, Boyington shot down 2 more Zeros, bringing his total to 28. Then, his Corsair was hit. Wounded by bullets and shrapnel, with his aircraft on fire, Boyington bailed out just 100 feet above the ocean. Japanese fighters strafed him in the water. He survived. The Imperial Japanese Navy submarine I-181 rescued him hours later. Boyington spent the next 20 months as a prisoner of war under the harshest conditions. When he returned to the United States in September 1945, he weighed 115 pounds. He was 32 years old and looked 50. Boyington was awarded the Medal of Honor for his actions over Rabaul. but he struggled with alcoholism and post-traumatic stress for the remainder of his life. He died in 1988 at age 75, never fully recovering from what the war had taken from him. Captain George Ashmun, shot down the same day as Boyington, didn't survive. His body was never recovered. Lieutenant Robert Hanson of VMF 215 became an ace over Rabaul, starting service in the squadron on October 6, 1943. He scored his first victory on November 1st. By the beginning of the large-scale battle for Rabaul, Hanson had 5 victories. In 17 days, he brought his combat score to 25 aircraft. On February 3, 1944, while attacking Japanese anti-aircraft positions, his aircraft was damaged and fell into the sea. He was 23 years old. Of the 26 original Black Sheep pilots who flew with Boyington, 8 were killed or missing by January 8, 1944. The squadron suffered nearly 40% casualties during their 2 combat tours, spanning 84 days. The Japanese pilots who faced Corsairs over Rabaul paid an even higher price. Of the 173 carrier aviators sent to Rabaul in Operation RO on November 1, 1943, fewer than 80 survived to return to their carriers. The attrition rate was over 50% in 3 months. These losses couldn't be replaced. Japan's pilot training program, designed for a short war where initial advantages would be decisive, couldn't sustain the rate of attrition the Pacific War demanded. By mid-1944, newly trained Japanese pilots arrived at combat units with perhaps 200 hours of flight time, half what American pilots received, and a fraction of what pre-war Japanese pilots had accumulated. The tactical disparity only widened. American pilots, trained in boom and zoom tactics, fighting in aircraft optimized for speed and firepower, systematically destroyed Japanese formations, flown by increasingly inexperienced pilots. The deeper lesson extended beyond aerial gunnery or tactical doctrine. It revealed something fundamental about industrial warfare in the modern age. Victory didn't necessarily come to the side with the most skilled individual operators or the most maneuverable weapons. Victory came to the side that could systematically analyze problems, develop solutions based on engineering principles rather than tradition, and implement those solutions across entire organizations. The Japanese had entered the war, believing that spirit, skill, and superior maneuverability could overcome material disadvantages. They built an entire tactical doctrine around the assumption that Japanese pilots, with their years of training and combat experience, flying the superbly agile Zero, would always defeat American pilots in close combat. That assumption was correct in 1942 and early 1943. American pilots who tried to dogfight Zeros died. The Japanese achieved kill ratios of 5-to-1 or better during this period. But the Americans learned. They analyzed combat film, they studied loss rates, they identified which tactics worked and which didn't. They developed doctrine that played to American strengths, speed, firepower, systematic discipline, and industrial capacity to replace losses. They trained pilots in energy management and altitude discipline. They enforced tactical doctrine through command structure. The transformation from defensive desperation in early 1943 to systematic dominance by late 1943 took less than a year. The Americans didn't suddenly develop better pilots or superior aircraft. They developed better doctrine and enforced it ruthlessly. The Corsair that arrived at Henderson Field in February 1943 was the same aircraft that dominated the skies over Rabaul in January 1944. The difference was how it was flown. The mathematical reality of boom and zoom tactics, combined with altitude discipline, made the Zero's maneuverability irrelevant. When American pilots refused to turn, Japanese pilot skill became meaningless. Engagements lasted 10 to 20 seconds and occurred at ranges beyond effective return fire. The Japanese wanted turning dogfights at close range. The Americans gave them diving attacks at high speed from altitude advantage. The success over Rabaul from November 1943 through February 1944 forced complete reassessment of fighter tactics throughout American naval aviation. What Marine squadrons had proven in land-based operations was rapidly adopted by carrier aviation. The Navy standardized on similar boom and zoom tactics for all fighter squadrons. Pilot training emphasized energy management and altitude discipline. Squadron commanders were evaluated on their ability to enforce tactical discipline, not on their individual aggressiveness. The results appeared during the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot on June 19, 1944. Over 300 Japanese carrier aircraft attacked the American fleet in multiple waves. Navy fighters, properly executing boom and zoom tactics, destroyed approximately 240 Japanese aircraft while losing fewer than 30 American fighters. The exchange ratio approached 8-1, nearly identical to what Marine squadrons had achieved over Rabaul 7 months earlier. By mid-1944, the tactical doctrine that began with experimental attacks by individual pilots had become universal American fighter doctrine in the Pacific. Every fighter unit, whether flying Corsairs, Hellcats, or P-38 Lightnings, employed variations of the same tactical approach: maintain altitude, dive to attack, fire at optimal range, extend immediately, never turn with the enemy. The Japanese attempted to adapt, but their aircraft and training system weren't designed for the type of combat the Americans imposed. The Zero's lightweight structure suffered control problems at speeds above 350 miles per hour. Attempting to match American boom and zoom tactics in an aircraft optimized for turning fights produced poor results. Lieutenant Saburo Sakai, reflecting on the transformation after the war, wrote, "By late 1944, we knew we couldn't win air battles against the Americans. Their tactics gave us no opportunity to use our advantages. We fought because duty demanded it, but we knew the outcome was predetermined. The Americans had learned to fight their war, not ours." The institutional legacy of Rabaul proved more durable than individual recognition. The United States Air Force, established as an independent service in 1947, incorporated boom and zoom tactics into its foundational doctrine. The Aerial Combat School at Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada taught these principles to every fighter pilot through the Korean War and into the jet age. Even after guns were supplemented by guided missiles, the underlying tactical philosophy remained constant. Refuse the enemy's preferred engagement and impose your own strengths. Maintain energy advantage. Never give the enemy the fight he wants. The mathematical principles that made boom and zoom effective at 20,000 feet with Corsairs applied equally to 40,000 feet with F-86 Sabres in Korea, and later to beyond visual range combat with F-15 seconds and F-16 seconds. The specific technology changed. The underlying logic: understand your capabilities and employ them at optimal ranges while denying the enemy his preferred engagement, remained constant. The morning of December 17, 1943, when Major Boyington led the first fighter sweep over Rabaul, represented more than a tactical victory. It marked the moment when systematic analysis overcame tradition, when engineering discipline defeated individual skill, when the Americans finally learned to fight their own war rather than the war their enemy wanted. The Japanese had spent decades perfecting a form of aerial combat that emphasized agility, close-range gunnery, and pilot skill. They built aircraft optimized for turning fights. They trained pilots for years in aerobatic maneuvers. They developed tactical doctrine around the assumption that superior maneuverability would always prevail in close combat. This assumption was entirely reasonable. It had been validated in China, in the Philippines, over Java and Burma, and the Solomon Islands. For 18 months, Japanese aerial supremacy seemed unshakable. What they hadn't anticipated was an enemy willing to refuse that type of combat entirely. The Americans couldn't build fighters that turned as tightly as the Zero. They couldn't train pilots with the same depth of experience. What they could do was apply systematic analysis to the problem of getting bullets on target while minimizing exposure to return fire. They could standardize tactical doctrine. They could enforce altitude discipline through command structure and training. They could develop energy management techniques that played to American strengths, speed, and firepower, while negating Japanese advantages. The transformation wasn't achieved through individual heroism, though individual pilots certainly displayed courage. It was achieved through systematic institutional learning. The military organization that could analyze combat results, identify effective tactics, and implement them across thousands of pilots would defeat the organization that relied on individual skill and traditional doctrine. By the time the war ended in August 1945, American air superiority over Japan was absolute. Fighters ranged freely over Japanese cities. Bombers operated without significant opposition. The transformation from desperate defensive battles in early 1943 to complete aerial dominance in 1945 had many causes: superior industrial production, sustainable pilot training systems, technological advantages in radar and communications. But underlying all of it was the systematic approach to combat that Rabaul represented. The Japanese had entered the war believing that spirit and skill could overcome material disadvantage. They learned at terrible cost that industrial warfare didn't work that way. The Americans had entered the war with inadequate doctrine and minimal experience. They learned through analysis and systematic improvement how to transform material advantages into battlefield dominance. The difference between these approaches, between tradition and analysis, between individual skill and systematic excellence, between fighting the enemy's war and imposing your own, determined the outcome of the Pacific Air War. The bent-wing Corsair that so many pilots initially called the Ensign Eliminator became the most capable carrier-based fighter bomber of World War II, but its reputation wasn't built on raw performance. It was built on the tactical doctrine that finally allowed American pilots to exploit that performance effectively. Altitude was paramount. Speed was life. Never turn with a zero. Fight your fight, not the enemy's. These principles, learned at terrible cost over places like Rabaul, defined American fighter aviation for generations. The sky above Simpson Harbor is quiet now. The anti-aircraft guns are silent. The airfields are overgrown. The harbor holds no warships. But the lessons learned there echo through every fighter squadron, every tactical manual. Every pilot who understands that victory comes not from fighting harder, but from fighting smarter. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.